In the sterile, wood-paneled classroom that always smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish, she tried to make herself small. Her name was Maya, and in the noisy, crowded hallways of Northwood High, she was mostly invisible, which was exactly how she liked it. She had her sketchbook, filled with charcoal drawings of twisting trees and distant birds, and she had the music in her head. That was enough. But in this room, Mr. Davies' music appreciation class, invisibility was a luxury she was denied from the very first week. He had decided she was an easy target. Mr. Davies was a man who seemed to be carved from the same stiff wood as his desk. He wore sharp, pressed suits, and his hair was cut with a severity that matched his personality. He believed music was a science, a set of unbreakable rules, and he had little patience for anyone who, in his view, treated it with anything less than cold, hard precision. Maya, who felt music in her bones and in the quiet thrum of her own heart, was a perfect candidate for his disappointment. It started with small things. A question about the Baroque period would hang in the air, and Maya, knowing the answer, would tentatively raise her hand. But her voice was always too soft, too hesitant. "Speak up, girl," he'd snap, his voice cutting through the silence. "We can't all hear your brilliant insights from the back row." The class would titter, and a hot blush would creep up her neck. She'd sink lower in her chair, wishing the floor would open up and swallow her whole. He never did this to the loud, confident kids who shouted out wrong answers. He saved his special brand of sharp-edged correction for her. Then came the incident with the staff paper. They had an assignment to notate a simple melody. Maya had spent hours on it at home, her pencil moving carefully, drawing each note and each rest with perfect, neat strokes. She was proud of it. The next day, he collected them, and as he flipped through the stack, he paused. He held her paper up to the light, a look of profound disgust on his face. "Class, may I have your attention?" he said, his voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that was far worse than his shouting. Every head turned. "I want you to observe this." He pointed a long, bony finger at her work. "This is a perfect example of carelessness. This stem here," he said, tapping it, "is a fraction of a millimeter too far to the left. And this beam? It is not perfectly parallel to the staff. This is not art, people. This is mathematics. This is a lack of respect for the composer, for the instrument, for the very language of music itself." He didn't say her name, but he didn't have to. He was looking right at her. He walked down the aisle and placed the paper on her desk, face down, like a sentence being handed down. The whispers and muffled giggles from her classmates felt like tiny needles pricking her skin. She stared at the neat little notes on the page, which had brought her so much joy just hours before, and now all she could see was the crooked stem, the imperfect beam. He had taken her small act of creation and turned it into a public shame. The worst part was how it began to poison the one thing she loved. She had an old upright piano at home, a hand-me-down from her grandmother. It had always been her sanctuary, a place where the messy, complicated feelings she couldn't say out loud could flow through her fingers and become something beautiful. But now, when she sat down to play, she could hear Mr. Davies' voice in her head. Asterisk careless. Lacks fundamental understanding. Not serious. Asterisk her fingers, which once danced across the keys, felt clumsy and slow. She would start a piece, a Chopin nocturne she adored, and suddenly freeze, second-guessing every note. Was her dynamics right? Was her phrasing precise enough? The joy was leaking out of it, replaced by a cold, paralyzing fear of being wrong. The music, her private language, was being invaded. He wasn't just in the classroom with her anymore. He was in her living room, his critical presence hovering over the piano keys. The other students sensed the shift. It's a simple, brutal math of high school life. When someone in a position of power targets a person, that person becomes an easy target for everyone. The quiet snickers in his class grew louder in the hallways. Someone accidentally knocked her books out of her hands, scattering her papers across the floor. A group of girls would fall silent and stare as she walked past, then burst into laughter as soon as she was out of earshot. They were small, stupid cruelties, but they came in a relentless daily trickle, slowly eroding the ground she stood on. She was being made a fool of, not just by the teacher, but by the entire world he had created around her. And the worst part was, a small, terrified voice inside her was starting to wonder if he was right. Maybe she was a joke. Maybe she was just a quiet girl who doodled in her notebook and dreamed of a talent she never really had. The days began to blur into a miserable cycle. Each morning, the walk to school felt a little heavier, the weight of her backpack a perfect match for the weight in her chest. Music class, which had once been the one bright spot in her day, was now a scheduled hour of anxiety. Mr. Davies seemed to have made it his personal mission to find new ways to chip away at her spirit. It was no longer just about her hesitant answers or her slightly imperfect notation. He became more creative, more cruel in his methods. One afternoon, he was demonstrating a piece on the classroom's small electric keyboard. He played a complicated run of notes with fluid ease, his fingers flying across the keys. "The secret," he said, his eyes scanning the room, "is not just speed, but precision. Every single note must be clear. It's about control." Then his gaze landed on Maya, a predator spotting the weakest member of the herd. "Perhaps you could demonstrate for us, Maya? Just the first 4 bars. Let's see if you can manage that much." A wave of heat washed over her. She could feel every pair of eyes in the room lock onto her. The keyboard seemed miles away. She shook her head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. I don't think I can," she whispered. "Nonsense," he said, his voice sharp and loud. "It's a very simple passage. Or are you telling me you've been paying even less attention than I thought?" The class snickered. It was a low, ugly sound that seemed to vibrate right through her bones. She remained glued to her chair, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. Mr. Davies sighed, a long, theatrical sound of disappointment. "As you can see, class," he said, turning back to the keyboard, "some people lack the courage to even try. And in music, if you don't try, you fail. It's that simple." He played the passage again, this time with an angry, staccato force that made the small speakers crackle. The real turning point came with the announcement for the school's annual fall showcase. The principal's voice echoed through the auditorium during morning assembly, full of cheerful encouragement for students to sign up and share their talents. As the assembly ended, the buzz of excitement filled the hallways. People were talking about bands they wanted to form, songs they wanted to sing, and magic tricks they wanted to perform. But for Maya, the announcement only filled her with a cold dread. The next day in music class, Mr. Davies stood by the sign-up sheet, which was taped to the wall near his desk. He watched the students with a hawk-like intensity. "Remember," he said, as a few kids went up to scribble their names, "this is a showcase for talent. Not for enthusiasm, not for effort, but for actual practice skill. We don't want to waste anyone's time." His eyes slid over to Maya's desk as he said it. The message was clear. She was the enthusiasm he was talking about. The waste of time. His campaign moved from public shaming to a more official, more damaging form of attack: her grades. On her next theory test, a test she had studied for hours, she got a C. Written in red ink at the top were the words, "Lacks fundamental understanding. Suggests a serious reevaluation of your priorities." On a short essay she wrote about the emotional impact of a Beethoven sonata. He simply wrote, "Sentimental drivel. Stick to the facts." Each red mark felt like a permanent stain, a formal judgment that she was in fact a fraud. These weren't just his opinions anymore. They were her grades, her official record. The poison was no longer just seeping in. It was being injected directly into her veins. She started to believe him. The voice in her head that used to be her own was slowly being replaced by his. Asterisk, "You're not good enough. You're a joke. You don't belong here." Asterisk, she stopped raising her hand, even when she knew the answer. She stopped doing her sketches in the back of the classroom, tucking her sketchbook away deep in her bag, as if it were something to be ashamed of. The school had a small, soundproofed practice room with a slightly out-of-tune upright piano. It used to be her refuge during lunch breaks. She would go in, close the door, and lose herself in the music for 20 minutes. But now she couldn't bring herself to even walk down that hallway. She was terrified that Mr. Davies might be passing by, that he might hear her through the door. The thought of his critical ear pressed against the wood, listening for a single wrong note, a single moment of hesitation, was paralyzing. The practice room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap dot at home. The old upright piano that had belonged to her grandmother sat in the corner of the living room, a silent monument to her fading joy. It was a beautiful piece of furniture, dark wood with intricate carvings on the legs. It used to call to her. Now, it just seemed to stare at her, a constant reminder of her failure. In the evenings, after her homework was done, she would force herself to sit on the worn velvet bench. Her hands, which used to feel so natural on the keys, now felt like foreign objects, heavy and awkward. She would place her fingers on the cool ivory, trying to start one of her favorite pieces, a gentle, flowing melody that she used to play to calm herself down. But the notes wouldn't come. Her fingers would freeze, hovering over the keys, her mind racing with his critical comments. Asterisk, is your posture correct? Is your wrist position perfect? Are you respecting the composer's intention? The music, which had always been a language of pure emotion for her, was now a set of rules she was constantly breaking. She would manage a few halting, clumsy notes, the sound ugly and disjointed in the quiet room. Then she would slam the lid down, the bang echoing her frustration, and run to her room, fighting back tears. The one thing that had always been hers, the one place she could go to escape the world, had been tainted. He had taken that from her. Her silence grew deeper, wrapping around her like a thick fog. In the hallways, she kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor. She ate her lunch alone in a quiet corner of the library, the company of books far safer than that of people. The whispers from her classmates seemed to fade into a dull, background roar. She was no longer just a quiet girl. She was a ghost, drifting through the school days, unseen and unheard. And the most terrifying part of all was that a small, quiet part of her was starting to think that this was exactly where she belonged. The morning assembly was always a predictable exercise in boredom. The entire student body was crammed into the stuffy gymnasium, the air thick with the smell of old sneakers and the faint, sweet scent of floor wax from the night before. Students, slumped in their seats on the hard wooden bleachers, whispering to each other, passing notes, or just staring blankly at the principal, a man with a kind face and a voice that seemed designed to put people to sleep. Maya sat near the back, tucked into a corner as usual, trying to make herself invisible. She had learned that being quiet and still was the best. Defense. The principal was droning on about upcoming football games and the importance of school spirit, when a new phrase cut through the fog of her attention. And this year, our annual fall showcase will have a very special feature. We are introducing a Teacher's Choice performance. A few kids perked up. One faculty member from the arts department will be given the honor of selecting a single student to represent their program in a featured solo performance. This is a chance for our teachers to showcase the exceptional talent and dedication they see every day. A strange, cold feeling trickled down Maya's spine. It was an instinct, a primal sense of danger. Her eyes, against her will, darted towards the section where the teachers were sitting. And there he was, Mr. Davies. He was listening intently, a small, thoughtful smile on his lips, but she knew him too well now. It wasn't a thoughtful smile. It was the smile of a predator that had just been handed a new, more effective weapon. She could see the gears turning in his mind. Around her, a few of the other music students glanced at each other, then at him. A hush of understanding, mixed with a little bit of fear, passed through their small group. They all knew who would be chosen for the music department's Teacher's Choice. The only question was who the unlucky victim would be. The rest of the day was a blur of quiet anxiety. In every class, she found herself replaying the principal's words in her head. *A featured solo performance. A chance to showcase talent. It was a nightmare waiting to happen. She tried to tell herself she was overreacting. Maybe he would choose one of his favorites, one of the students who could already play perfectly and would make him look good. But a deeper, more cynical part of her knew better. This wasn't about making him look good. It was about making someone else look bad. It was the ultimate power move, a public stage for his private cruelty. The next day, she walked into music class feeling like she was heading to her own execution. The atmosphere in the room was different. It was charged with a tense, almost electric anticipation. Everyone was watching Mr. Davies, waiting. He took his time, arranging the papers on his desk, taking a slow sip of his coffee, letting the silence stretch until it was unbearable. He could feel the eyes on him, and he was enjoying it. Finally, he looked up, a pleasant, almost gentle smile on his face. "Good morning, class," he said, his voice smoother than usual. "I'm sure you are all aware of the new Teacher's Choice segment for the fall showcase." He paused, looking around the room, making eye contact with several students. "I have given this a great deal of thought. It is a tremendous honor and a tremendous responsibility. I believe in fairness. I believe in giving every student an opportunity to shine, even those who may not. Shall we say possess the most obvious natural gifts?" His words hung in the air, thick with condescension. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Maya's heart began to pound against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She knew. She knew what was coming. She stared down at her desk, at the small carved initials left by students from years ago, focusing on them as if they were the most important thing in the world, as if by not looking at him she could make herself disappear. "It's important to encourage effort," he continued, his voice dropping to a more sincere, confidential tone. "To reward those who try even if the results are unpolished. It builds character. It teaches us all a lesson." He let that sink in for a moment. Then his gaze swept across the room one last time before landing, with unerring accuracy, on her. "Therefore," he said, his voice clear and loud, "I have chosen my representative for the showcase." The world seemed to slow down. The ticking of the clock on the wall became a loud, deliberate hammer blow. Tick-tock tick, she could feel the sweat beading on her forehead. She could feel the eyes of every single student in the room boring into her. "Maya," he said, her name a soft, poisonous puff of air, "why don't you play something for us?" "For the showcase?" A collective gasp went through the room, followed instantly by a wave of muffled giggles and shocked whispers. It was exactly what she had feared, 100 times worse than she had imagined. He hadn't just chosen her. He had framed it as an act of charity, a lesson to the rest of the class. He was holding her up as a perfect example of effort without talent, a living, breathing, cautionary tale. "It will be a good learning experience for you," he added, his smile widening. "Something simple, of course. We don't want to put too much pressure on you." The laughter was a little louder now. It wasn't mean-spirited, not really. It was the laughter of relief, of kids who were thankful it wasn't them. It was the laughter of a pack that had seen the Omega singled out by the Alpha. For Maya, it was the sound of her world crumbling. She felt a hot, prickling sensation crawl up her neck and flood her face. She was sure she was as red as a beet. She wanted to run, to scream, to flip her desk over, but she was frozen, paralyzed by a humiliation so complete it felt like a physical weight, pinning her to her chair. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. She just stared at her hands, clenched into tight fists in her lap, her knuckles white. The bell rang, a shrill, jarring sound that shattered the moment. The other students scrambled to gather their things, eager to escape the tense atmosphere and gossip in the hallways. Maya didn't move. She just sat there, long after the room was empty, the echo of their laughter still ringing in her ears. He had done it. He had built the stage, lit the lights, and now all of her school was invited to watch her fail. The night of the fall showcase arrived with a cold, biting wind that seemed to mirror the chill in Maya's heart. The school auditorium, usually a place of dusty assemblies and boring lectures, had been transformed. The stage was bathed in a warm, golden light, and a grand piano, its black lacquer surface gleaming like a pool of dark water, sat center stage. The seats were filling up quickly, a sea of parents, teachers, and students, their excited chatter creating a low, steady hum that vibrated through the floorboards. Backstage in the cramped, dimly lit wings, that hum sounded like the growling of a beast waiting to devour her. She felt sick. Her stomach was a tight, twisted knot, and her hands were so cold they felt like ice. She had spent the last few days in a daze, a state of numb disbelief. She had considered feigning sickness or even just running away and not showing up at all. But a small, stubborn part of her, a part that hadn't been completely crushed by Mr. Davies, refused to let him win that way. If she was going to be humiliated, she would be there to face it. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of her absence, a student council member. A senior with a bright, forced smile poked her head backstage. "Maya, you're on after the magician. Get ready." The magician, a lanky boy who fumbled his cards and dropped his rabbit, got a few polite chuckles and a smattering of applause. As he scurried off the stage, the lights dimmed even further, leaving only a single, dramatic spotlight on the piano. This was it. Her legs felt like lead as she walked out from behind the heavy velvet curtain. The walk from the wings to the piano was only 20 feet, but it felt like a mile-long journey. The bright spotlight hit her, blinding her, and for a moment, all she could see was a wall of light and the dark shapes of the audience beyond it. The low hum of conversation died down as people realized she was the next act. A few whispers rippled through the crowd. She could feel their eyes on her, the quiet girl from the back of the class. They were expecting a train wreck. Mr. Davies had set the stage perfectly. Her eyes scanned the front row. And there he was, Mr. Davies, sitting with his arms crossed over his chest. A look of cool, detached expectation on his face. He wasn't smirking, not exactly. It was worse than that. He had the look of a scientist about to observe a failed experiment, utterly confident in the outcome. He had already written her off, and his presence was a final, crushing weight on her spirit. She reached the piano bench and sat down. The polished wood was cool and smooth beneath her trembling fingers. She adjusted the bench, her movements slow and deliberate, trying to buy herself a few more seconds. The auditorium was completely silent now, a silence thick with judgment and anticipation. She could hear her own heartbeat, a frantic, wild drum solo in her chest. She took a deep, shaky breath, the air feeling thin and insufficient. She was supposed to play something simple, something unpolished, but full of effort. That's what they were all waiting for, but then something shifted inside her. As she sat there, under the harsh glare of the spotlight, with the ghost of Mr. Davies' contempt washing over her, a different feeling began to rise. It wasn't courage. It was anger. A quiet, cold, and furious anger at all the tiny humiliations, at the condescending comments, at the way he had poisoned the one thing she loved. He had taken her music and tried to turn it into a joke. He had tried to turn her into a joke. She closed her eyes. She blocked out the faces, the silence, the suffocating expectation. She thought of her grandmother's piano, the one at home, and the hours she had spent there in secret, not for a grade or for approval, but for herself. She thought of the piece she had been playing, a fierce and complicated piece by Rachmaninoff that she had learned from a worn-out songbook. It was a piece that was all storm and fire, a piece that was too big, too loud, too much for the quiet girl everyone thought she was. It was her secret. And tonight she was going to let it out. She placed her fingers on the keys, not with the hesitation of a student, but with the quiet certainty of a musician. And then she began to play. The first notes that rang out were not the simple, gentle melody anyone expected. They were a torrent of sound, a cascade of powerful, thundering chords that filled the vast auditorium and seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. It was a shock to the system. The collective gasp from the audience was almost audible. People who had been leaning back in their seats, ready for a cringeworthy performance, suddenly sat bolt upright. Her fingers, which had felt so clumsy and heavy for months, now moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible. They flew across the keys, a blur of motion, unleashing a storm of complex harmonies and driving rhythms. The music was not just loud. It was alive. It was filled with a raw, untamed emotion that was both beautiful and terrifying. It spoke of struggle, of longing, of a desperate fight against an overwhelming force. It was the sound of her own heart, finally given a voice. In the front row, Mr. Davies' detached expression shattered. His eyes widened, his jaw went slack. He leaned forward as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The scientific observer was gone, replaced by a man witnessing a phenomenon he couldn't explain or control. The students in the audience were in a state of pure shock. The girl they knew, the quiet one who never spoke, who they had laughed at, was creating this world of sound with her bare hands. They looked at each other, their faces filled with disbelief and awe. The whispers were gone. There was only the music. It demanded their full attention, pulling them into its powerful current. One by one, they stopped fidgeting, stopped checking their phones, stopped whispering to their friends. They were completely, utterly mesmerized. As the piece reached its climax, the music swelled into a crescendo of such breathtaking power and passion that it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. Maya was no longer just playing the piano. She was one with it. Her body swayed with the music, her eyes still closed, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. It was an exorcism. With every thundering chord, she was purging herself of the doubt, the shame, and the humiliation. She was taking all the pain he had inflicted on her and transforming it into something magnificent, something undeniable. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm subsided. The final, haunting chords echoed through the hall, each one hanging in the air like a question before fading into a profound, absolute silence. The silence lasted for a full 5 seconds. It was a sacred, stunned silence, the kind of silence that only comes after a truly transformative experience. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the entire audience had been collectively struck by lightning. Then a single person in the back row started to clap. It was quickly joined by another and another until the silence was shattered by an explosion of sound. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a deafening, roaring, joyous noise. The entire auditorium was on its feet, a sea of cheering, shouting, whistling people, their faces alight with shock and admiration. Maya opened her eyes. The spotlight was no longer blinding. It felt warm like an embrace. She saw the standing ovation, the faces beaming at her. She looked down at the front row, at Mr. Davies. He was still sitting, his face a mask of pale, utter disbelief. He had been defeated, not by an argument, not by a complaint, but by a truth so powerful it had rendered him speechless. A small, tired, but genuine smile touched Maya's lips. She had found her voice, and the whole world was finally listening. The sound that hit her was not just applause. It was a physical force, a wave of pure, unadulterated joy that washed over the stage and seemed to lift her right out of her seat. It was a deafening, roaring, joyous noise that vibrated in her chest and made the floorboards tremble. For a moment she just sat there, her fingers still resting on the keys, her mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. The single tear on her cheek was joined by another, not from sadness, but from a release so profound it felt like a dam breaking inside her. The faces in the audience were a blur of light and shadow, but she could feel their energy, a collective shock and admiration that was so powerful it was almost terrifying. She saw the entire student body on their feet, a sea of people cheering for her. The quiet girl from the back of the class. The girl who had been made a fool of, a slow, tired, but genuine smile spread across her face. She gave a small, hesitant nod to the audience, then pushed herself up from the piano bench. Her legs felt a little shaky, like they might give out, but they held her. The walk off the stage was the complete opposite of her walk on. 20 feet had never felt so long, and now, 20 feet had never felt so short. The heavy velvet curtain swallowed her as she stepped behind it, and the roar of the crowd was muffled to a dull, comforting thud. Backstage it was chaos. A stagehand gave her a thumbs up so wide it looked like it might hurt his hand. The magician, who had fumbled his cards just minutes before, stared at her with open-mouthed awe. "Wow," he mouthed, the single word more powerful than any standing ovation. Then, the other students from the show began to crowd around her. A girl from the choir, one of the popular ones who had never so much as looked in her direction before, pushed through the small crowd. Her face was flushed with excitement. I had no idea," she stammered, her eyes wide. "I've never heard anything like that. That was incredible." Another student, a boy who played the guitar in a local band, just shook his head in disbelief. "Dude," he said, then seemed to catch himself. "I mean, Maya, that was epic. Seriously." There were no jokes, no whispers, no smug looks. There was only a genuine, almost reverent respect. They weren't just looking at the quiet girl anymore. They were looking at the artist who had just blown the roof off the school. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. The next day at school, the world had shifted on its axis. The walk to school, which had felt like a march to the gallows for months, now felt light, almost buoyant. The cold November sun seemed a little brighter. The moment she stepped through the front doors, she could feel the change. The usual river of students parting around her like she was a stone in the stream was gone. Instead, people met her eyes. They smiled. They nodded. A group of freshmen, who she didn't even know, stopped talking as she walked by and just watched her go, their faces filled with a kind of starstruck wonder. In the hallway between classes, a girl from her history class stopped her. "Hey," she said a little nervously. "I was at the showcase last night. You were amazing. My little brother takes piano lessons, and now all he can talk about is wanting to play like you." It was such a simple, kind thing to say, but it meant the world. It was a sign that her performance hadn't just been a momentary shock. It had rippled outwards, changing the way people saw her, and even the way they thought about music itself. But the real test was music class. As she walked in, the usual tense silence was replaced by a different kind of quiet. It was a respectful, attentive silence. Every eye in the room followed her to her seat. Mr. Davies was already at his desk, but he didn't look up. He was shuffling papers, his movements stiff and unnatural. He couldn't bring himself to look at her. The power dynamic in the room had been completely and irrevocably flipped. He was no longer the predator. He was the one who was cornered. The class was uncomfortable for everyone, especially him. He stumbled through his lecture on the history of the symphony, his usual confident, authoritative tone replaced by a hesitant, rambling monotone. He avoided asking her any questions, which was a relief, but also felt like a strange, new form of erasure. He couldn't praise her because that would be admitting he was wrong. He couldn't criticize her because he would look like a fool. So he simply pretended she wasn't there, but everyone else knew she was. Her presence filled the room, a silent, powerful testament to the talent he had tried so hard to squash. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Maya gathered her things slowly, bracing herself for the inevitable. As she reached the door, his voice, quiet and strained, stopped her. "Maya, could you stay for a moment?" Her heart sank, but she turned around. The other students filed out, some of them giving her sympathetic or encouraging looks as they passed. Soon, they were alone in the silent, wood-paneled room. He didn't look at her, not at first. He just stared at his desk, straightening a stack of papers that was already perfectly straight. The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken words. Finally, he took a deep breath and looked up, but his eyes couldn't seem to focus on hers. They darted around her face, at the wall behind her, at the floor. "Your performance last night was adequate," he mumbled, the word hanging in the air between them, pathetic and absurd. It was the most massive understatement she had ever heard, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to cling to some shred of his authority. It was an insult wrapped in a compliment, and in its weakness, it was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. He cleared his throat, his face a pale, splotchy red. The advanced placement theory class has an opening for the next semester. If you're interested, you may sign up." He didn't say she should or that she deserved it. He just stated it as a fact, an offering he couldn't bring himself to frame as a reward. Maya looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. She didn't see the cruel, powerful teacher who had tormented her for months. She just saw a small, deflated man, defeated by a truth he couldn't deny. She felt no surge of triumph, no desire for revenge. She just felt a quiet, calm sense of peace. She didn't need his approval anymore. She didn't need his validation. The standing ovation from her peers, the shock on his face, the music still echoing in her own heart, that was all the validation she would ever need. She gave a small, simple nod. "Okay," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Thank you." She turned and walked out of the room, leaving him alone with his perfectly straight papers and his shattered pride. That evening, she went home and sat down at her grandmother's old piano. The house was quiet. She placed her fingers on the keys, and for the first time in a long time, they felt like they were coming home. She didn't play the Rachmaninoff. She didn't play anything complicated or fierce. She played a simple, gentle melody, one that she had made up herself. The notes flowed out of her, pure and effortless, filling the quiet house with a sound that was full of peace and joy and a quiet, unshakable confidence. The music was hers again, and this time no one could ever take it away.